38 years taught me that patience is the ultimate weapon. My name is Garrett. At 11:04 p.m., my wife, Amber, walked into our Savannah studio smelling like hotel gin. She smirked. I slept with Mark Hendricks. She said like she was winning a prize. And honestly, I'd do it again. I didn't look up from my drafting table. I just kept sketching federal style molding. She expected a scream. She didn't know I'd already spent 12 months dismantling the foundation beneath her feet. If you discovered your partner was systematically sabotaging your life's work, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait until you had the power to finish it on your own terms? The graphite pencil scratched rhythmically across the thick vellum. I was focused on the profile of a federal-style cornice, a detail for a restoration project on Monterey Square. I didn't look up. I didn't pause. The lead moved in precise, steady arcs. Behind me, the silence of the studio was heavy smelling of the damp Savannah night, and the sharp metallic tang of the gin Amber had been drinking. I could feel her eyes on the back of my neck. She was waiting for the theatrical implosion, the shattered glass, the desperate questioning that would confirm her status as the person who still held the remote control to my emotions. But I had stopped reacting to her months ago. Looking back now, I realized that some things don't break all at once. They rot from the inside quietly, invisibly, until the weight of a single word brings the whole roof down. 12 years of marriage had apparently reduced our connection to a sequence of performed scripts, and she had just delivered what she thought was the final act. Did you hear me, Garrett? Her voice was higher now, the practiced smirk beginning to fray at the edges. I said, I slept with Mark. I'm with him. Your rival, the man who's been trying to underbid you on the Mercer House for 3 years. I blew a small cloud of graphite dust off the paper. The hum of the ceiling fan was the only other sound in the room. Mark Hendricks was 52, a developer who viewed historical preservation as a hurdle to be cleared with enough money and the right handshakes. He was the kind of man who wore custom-fitted blazers to casual lunches and called everyone chief. He was also the man Amber had decided was her ticket out of our life. The pencil lead is soft, I said quietly, still not turning around. If I press too hard, the line loses its integrity. Just like a foundation, Amber. You can't fix a rotten joist with a fresh coat of paint. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She didn't want metaphors. She wanted a fight. She wanted to see me broken so she could feel justified in her exit. If I was the boring, cold architect, then her betrayal was just a search for warmth. But my silence was stripping that narrative away from her. I wasn't cold, I was simply finished. That's it, she hissed, stepping further into the room. No shouting, no asking how long. I just told you I'm with the one person you despise. And you're sketching molding. I finally laid the pencil down on the tray. I turned the drafting stool, slowly, looking at her for the first time. She looked exactly as she had for a year, polished, entitled, and entirely unaware that she was standing in a house I had already vacated emotionally. It's an intricate molding, Amber, I said. And the thing about restoration is that you have to decide what's worth saving before you start the teardown. I made that decision a long time ago. Her irritation flared into something darker. She hated being irrelevant. She needed to be the fire, but all she found was an ash-covered hearth. You're pathetic, she said, her voice trembling with a frustration she couldn't hide. Mark was right. You're yesterday's news, Garrett. You're so buried in your dusty blueprints, you didn't even notice your own wife leaving you right under your nose. I didn't tell her I'd noticed everything. I didn't tell her about the 12 months of documentation sitting in a safe deposit box. I didn't tell her that the news she was so proud of was already a year old to me. If you're finished, I said, I'd like to get back to this. It has to be at the printers by 8 a.m. She stared at me, her face contorting into an expression that was half laugh, half disgust. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the stairs, her expensive heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the heart pine floors. I sat there for a moment, the silence rushing back in to fill the space she'd left. I wasn't a victim. I was an auditor, and the audit was nearly complete. It began with a single missing zero on a spreadsheet. 12 months ago, while the rest of Savannah was sleeping under the heavy, humid blanket of a July night, I was sitting in the same studio, staring at the accounts for the Forsyth Preservation Grant. We had a reputation built on precision, a currency more stable than the fluctuating real estate market in Georgia. But that night, the math stopped making sense. $128,000 had vanished into a network of consultancy fees and expedited permit costs paid to a vendor I'd never heard of, Apex Architectural Consulting. If I'm being honest, I think I knew the answer before I even finished the audit. Amber was our head of operations. She held the keys to the kingdom while I spent my days in the limestone dust of construction sites. She was the one at the galas, the one navigating the social hierarchy of the historic board, the one who made sure our name was whispered in the right drawing rooms. I had trusted her with the machinery of our life because I thought our goals were synchronized. Looking back now, I can see the boiling frog of her ethical decay. It's a trap I call the normalization of cruelty. It didn't start with a massive theft. It started with small blurred lines, a personal dinner charged to a client, a finder's fee for a contractor. She had spent years convincing herself that she was the true engine of the firm. In her mind, because I was the one with the dirty boots and the drafting pencil, I was just the labor. She felt she was the visionary who deserved a premium for her social labor, a premium she decided to collect without my permission. The $128,000 wasn't just money, it was a paper trail of betrayal. Amber had been taking systematic kickbacks from Mark Hendricks to smooth over regulatory hurdles on his mid-market developments, the kind of cut-rate projects that our firm usually stood against. She was selling our reputation to my biggest rival, piece by piece, and using the proceeds to fund the very performance she used to blind me. At the time, I didn't realize how deep the rot had gone. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses, and realized my marriage wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a crime scene. I could have confronted her that night. I could have stormed into the bedroom and demanded an explanation. But a man who restores buildings knows that you never pull a support beam until you've shored up the rest of the house. I waited, I catalogued. I spent the next year becoming the silent investor in her version of our life, watching her overdraft my trust until the account was empty. 3 weeks after that discovery, I sat in a dimly lit, unglamorous cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where Amber wouldn't be caught dead. I was waiting for Teresa, an attorney who understood that when a structure is this compromised, the only solution is a controlled demolition. Precision is the only language a court truly understands. Teresa sat across from me in that vinyl booth cafe, her eyes scanning the forensic audit I'd spent months compiling. She was a product of the 1980s elite and clinical, the kind of attorney who didn't deal in emotions, only in enforceable outcomes. She didn't offer me a shoulder to cry on. She offered a scalpel. The risk, she said, tapping a manicured finger on the spreadsheet, is that Amber is smart. If you move these assets too close to a divorce filing, she'll argue you're trying to defraud her. We need a legitimate business purpose for every single transfer. I looked at her kickbacks are the purpose. She's turned our firm into a liability. I'm protecting the clients. We began the process of measuring twice. Over the next few hours, we laid the groundwork for a complete architectural shift. I established a new entity, Federal Restoration Group. I systematically moved the 41 active property management contracts and my professional historic certifications into this new vault. Everything was documented. Everything was above board. I wasn't hiding the business. I was insulating my legacy from the rot. I had already moved the children's college funds into irrevocable trusts. I made sure their future was a fortress that even a federal audit couldn't storm. But there was friction, a price I had to pay to ensure my exit was legally survivable. To avoid any claim that I was stripping her of everything, I had to leave the Jones Street mansion on the table. That building was the pride of my career, a federal-style masterpiece I had spent 3 years restoring with my own hands. Letting it go felt like losing a limb. If she gets the building, she'll think she's won, Teresa noted. Let her think it, I said. A house is just an empty vessel if the architect isn't in it. Looking back now, I realize that some forms of loyalty are just heavy anchors we've mistaken for foundations. I was paying for my clean break with the very walls I'd labored over. I signed the restructuring agreements in increments of 432 signatures that quietly moved the machinery of my life out of her reach. By the time we finished, the original firm was a ghost. It still held the title to the mansion, but the mansion was now leveraged against a business that had no clients left. Teresa checked her watch. The paper trail is conservative, Garrett. It's boring. And in a courtroom, boring wins. I'm a restorer, I told her. I don't mind the slow work. I left the cafe and drove past Jones Street one last time. I saw the lights on in the upstairs office where Amber was likely still managing her narrative. She had no idea that she was currently the co-owner of a radioactive shell company with a bank balance of $414.14. The clock was ticking. Mark Hendricks was moving on the Forsyth project tonight, and he was about to find out that the signature he'd bought from my wife wasn't worth the paper it was forged on. Arrogance is a blindfold. Amber arrived at the office at 9 a.m. the following morning, dressed in a sharp ivory suit that screamed victory lap. She didn't look like a woman who had just confessed to a 4-year betrayal. She looked like a CEO arriving to claim her dividends. She walked past my mezzanine desk without a glance, her perfume, that metallic, expensive scent, trailing behind her like an unwanted ghost. I watched from above as she cornered Elias, my lead mason. Elias had been with me for 15 years. He understood the soul of Savannah limestone better than anyone in the state. Amber didn't care about his craft. She stood in the center of the drafting room, arms crossed, her voice carrying that specific tone of performative authority she used when she wanted to remind the world of her status. Elias, we're halting the Monterey project, she said, loud enough for the 3 junior architects to hear. Mark's crew is going to take over the masonry work. They're more efficient. We need to focus on the bottom line now. Elias looked up at me, confusion etched into the deep lines of his face. I didn't say a word. I just gave him a slight, clinical nod. Amber took my silence for submission. She thought she was finally the one holding the scalpel, unaware that I'd already removed the patient from the room. Looking back now, I realized that some people only value power when it's being used to diminish someone else. Arrogance is a blindfold. She was so busy watching her own performance that she didn't notice the stage was being dismantled behind her. To her, this was a hostile takeover. To me, it was just the final cleaning of a worksite. At 10:15 a.m., my personal line buzzed. I didn't need to see the caller ID to know it was Mark Hendricks. Garrett, chief, he began, his voice dripping with the fake sympathy of a man who's already picked out your grave plot. I heard about the conversation with Amber last night. Look, man to man, maybe it's time you retired. You've had a good run with the historic stuff, but the market is moving fast. We can make this transition easy, or we can make it legal. Your choice. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Spanish moss, swaying in the wind outside the window. I hit the record button on my desk phone with a steady finger. It's always a choice, Mark, I said, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. But I've found that when people move too fast, they tend to ignore the structural integrity of the deal. You should really check the load-bearing capacity of that Forsyth project before you break ground tonight. He laughed a rich, hollow sound. Don't worry about my capacity, Garrett. Amber's already cleared the variances. We've got the signatures. We've got the board's blessing. You're just noise now. I didn't tell him that the signatures he'd paid for were on documents I had already flagged with the State Historic Preservation Office. I didn't tell him that his blessing was based on a blueprint that was legally radioactive. I just listened to the hum of the line, the sound of a man who thought he was winning a race while running toward a cliff. Good luck with the groundbreaking, Mark, I said, and hung up. I went back to my sketches. The junior architects were whispering, and Amber was in her office, likely on the phone with her lawyer, Gerald Fitch. She believed that by claiming the firm's physical space and its biggest rival's support, she had won the war. She didn't understand that I wasn't fighting for the building anymore. I was waiting for the foundation to fail. Forgery is a sloppy way to build a legacy. Amber believed that by bypassing my rigid standards, she was finally proving she was the superior operator. She thought the federal preservation statutes were just suggestions, red tape meant for smaller minds. In her haste to secure Mark's approval and cement their new empire, she had forged my signature on 4 separate variance requests for the Forsyth project. I found the digital copies 3 months ago. I didn't delete them. I didn't even lock the folder. I simply watched the timestamps. Looking back now, I see the classic architecture of a narcissistic injury. She couldn't admit that she lacked the technical expertise to navigate federal law, so she convinced herself that the law didn't apply to her. She felt powerful in the act of erasing me, signing my name with the breezy confidence of a woman who thought I was too broken to ever check the ledger. She had authorized a demolition of a structural interior that was protected under the National Historic Preservation Act. By forging my name on those permits, she hadn't just committed a personal betrayal, she had anchored herself to a federal crime. I had spent the last 90 days quietly communicating with the State Historic Preservation Office. I didn't frame it as a report on my wife. I framed it as a professional inquiry regarding unauthorized signatures on active projects. At 2:45 p.m., I stood by the window of the studio and watched the first construction fence go up around the Forsyth site. It looked like progress to them. To me, it looked like a containment unit for a $250,000 fine. The moment they broke ground, the liability became active. Because Amber had signed a personal guarantee on the project's performance, Bond convinced she was cementing her partnership with Mark, she was now personally tethered to every cent of those regulatory fines. If I'm being honest, I felt a flicker of the old heaviness, watching the woman I once trusted walk into a trap she had spent 12 months building for herself. But some forms of debt can't be settled with an apology. They require a total liquidation of the ego. I turned away from the window and picked up the manila envelope containing the transfer of ownership. It was time to give her exactly what she had asked for. The end of a 12-year partnership shouldn't be loud. I walked into Amber's office at precisely 4:15 p.m. She was leaning back in her high-backed leather chair, her ivory suit pristine, staring out the window at the Jones Street garden. She looked like an owner who had finally cleared the help off her property. I didn't knock. I just walked to the mahogany desk we'd bought together in Savannah 14 years ago and laid a heavy manila envelope on the polished surface. The keys. I said my voice as level as a freshly poured foundation. The building title, the original corporate charters, everything belonging to the firm we established in 2012. She didn't open the envelope immediately. She just looked at me, her eyes tracking my face for a sign of the collapse she had been predicting. "You're taking this surprisingly well, Garrett," she said, her voice dripping with that performative sweetness that had once blinded me. "I expected a fight. I expected you to at least try to keep the Jones Street office. It's your legacy, isn't it?" "A legacy isn't made of bricks and mortar, Amber," I replied. "It's made of integrity. You wanted the business. You and Mark. It's all yours now." Looking back now, I realized that her arrogance was her greatest weakness. She was so focused on the physical symbols of power, the mansion, the elite address, the corner office, that she didn't bother to check the plumbing. I didn't tell her that Federal Restoration Group had already been operational for 6 months. I didn't tell her that our 41 active clients, whose contracts all contained a keyman clause tied specifically to my license, had already exercised their right to follow the architect, not the office. "Everything is in order," I continued. "Teresa has filed the final exit paperwork. As of 5 p.m. today, you are the sole managing officer of the original LLC. You have total control." She smiled, and for a second, she actually looked happy. It was the kind of happiness you see in someone who has just won a lottery they didn't realize was rigged. She didn't know that the $300,000 bridge loan I'd taken out last month, authorized by the power of attorney she'd signed years ago to avoid the boredom of banking, had effectively stripped the remaining equity from the Jones Street building. She was inheriting a mansion that was more debt than dwelling. "I'm glad we could be adults about this," she said, finally picking up the envelope. "So am I said. I turned toward the door. I could hear the humid Savannah breeze rattling the window panes. "You might want to call Mark. I believe the Historic District Board inspectors are visiting the Forsyth site tomorrow morning. Something about unauthorized signatures on the variance requests." The smirk on her face didn't vanish, it froze. It was a slow-motion architectural failure. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice losing its ivory polish. "It's all in the files, Amber," I said, not looking back. "Everything I did was legal, everything I did was documented, and everything I left for you is exactly what you earned." If I'm being honest, I expected to feel more. I expected a surge of triumph or a wave of regret. But as I walked down the stairs of the mansion for the last time, all I felt was the quiet peace of a job finished. I walked out to my truck, which was idling at the curb, and threw the last of my things into the passenger seat. I had measured twice. I was finally done cutting. 6 months is enough time for the dust of a demolition to settle. Amber's professional architectural license was suspended for 3 years following the ethics inquiry into the Forsyth project. The Savannah Morning News ran a piece on the structural failures of professional integrity, a headline that didn't name me, but stripped the ivory polish off her reputation forever. Mark Hendricks did exactly what a user does. He performed a strategic withdrawal. He settled with the internal auditors, resigned quietly in December, and moved his operations to Arizona. He left Amber with the legal wreckage of the original firm and $250,000 in regulatory fines. The Jones Street mansion went into foreclosure 4 months ago. It turns out a house built on debt and deceit cannot stand once the primary investor stops paying the bill. Looking back now, I realize that my survival wasn't a product of my anger, but of my accounting. I didn't want to burn her world down. I just wanted to stop being the one who supplied the fuel. If I'm being honest, there were nights in that extended stay room where the silence felt less like peace and more like an empty room I had to learn how to inhabit. I spent 12 years building a life for two. And while the kids were away at boarding school, shielded from the immediate fallout, learning to build, for one at the age of 38, felt like starting a foundation in the middle of a storm. But I'm in a new studio now on Eagle Street. It is a third-floor walk-up with tall, arched windows that let in the Savannah sun and a draft that reminds me the building is alive. The name on the door is mine and mine alone. I've been volunteering my Saturdays to help restore low-income historic housing, the kind of work that doesn't win galas or get featured in high society magazines. It pays in a currency Amber could never understand, the quiet satisfaction of a joist made level and a roof made tight. It took me a year to understand that the most dangerous move isn't the one that destroys your enemy, it's the one that makes them irrelevant. Revenge isn't about the fire you start in someone else's life. It's about the silence you finally find in your own. I had been the silent investor in her version of family for too long, footing the bill for a performance I wasn't even cast in. Breaking that subscription was the only way to save the architect. The portrait of my mother, Mary, hangs in my new office. It's the first thing I see when I unlock the door at 7 a.m. every morning. She has a look in her eyes that I finally recognize, the look of someone who knows that dignity is the only thing you can't buy back once you've sold it. I think about the 41 clients who followed me to this new practice, people who valued the man over the address. They taught me that a reputation isn't a performance you manage. It's the structural integrity of your word. I drove past Jones Street one last time, shortly after the divorce was finalized, in a grey January courtroom. The new owners had painted the front door a deep navy blue and were planting hydrangeas where Amber's prize roses used to be. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a wave of regret. I just sat at the end of the street and watched a young couple carry a crate of groceries through that navy door. I thought about the 14 years I spent in that house, about the good parts that did exist, and the children we raised who were now safe and shielded from the rot we had created. I put the truck in drive and didn't look in the rearview mirror. I had spent 14 months measuring, documenting, and waiting. I'd seen the collapse coming, and I'd stepped out of the way, making sure the only thing that fell was the facade. I was worlds away from the man she thought I was, and 38 years into the man I had finally become. I'd measured twice. I was finally done cutting. Have you ever found yourself staying in a situation long after the foundation had rotted, simply because you were the one holding the house together? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your perspective on when a person should stop restoring and start over.